Hello, I'm Professor Cho Sung-ik from the College of Architecture and Urban Studies at Hongik University. Could those of you who live alone please raise your hands? Thank you. And those who live with someone else? All right, very good. Now, are there any of you who live with someone but are so fed up that you really wish you could live alone? All right. Yes, I see some of you. Currently, over 30% of all households in our country are single-person households. And even if they don't live alone, more and more people like you are dreaming of having their own freedom. People are getting married later, and unfortunately, as divorces are also increasing, the number of people living alone is rising even more. And the increase in average life expectancy is also an issue. In this situation, after losing a partner, there are cases where people have to live alone for a very long time. So, regardless of age or marital status, living alone has now become an unavoidable reality for everyone. So in today's lecture, I'd like to talk about how to live happily alone and the skills needed to live healthily on your own. But in order to live alone, there's something absolutely essential. What is it? Is it money or love? Yes, it is home. You need your own cozy nest where you can enjoy a wonderful solo lifestyle. Everyone, the most famous home for living alone. Do you know what that is? It's a small cabin built by the American writer Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau was an elite among elites, having graduated from Harvard University. He left the city and one day in 1845 built a house for himself by a quiet lakeside. And there he wrote a book called Walden. Yes. It's regarded as a book that helped later generations rediscover the value of solitude. In short, Thoreau was a philosopher of solitary living, a kind of Socrates of living alone. But there's a big twist hidden here. How long do you think Thoreau lived in that cabin? Naturally, you'd assume he lived there his whole life, right? But actually, he only lived there for 2 years before returning to the city. Am I the only one who feels a bit betrayed? He even adapted really well to city life. He worked hard and lived as a close friend of Emerson, who was the greatest intellectual, poet, and philosopher of his time. I mean, these days, even just appearing once on I Am a Natural Person is a big deal, you know? You have to live alone in the mountains for at least 5 years just to have any credibility. Isn't that so? But actually, we can really understand Thoreau's feelings. When we live with others, we want to be alone. But if we're alone for too long, we get lonely and want to be with someone. I think that the kind of home we need now is one that embraces this duality of human nature. I once heard the story of a woman in her 20s who lives alone. She was living by herself in a studio apartment, and one day the doorbell rang. When she cautiously opened the door, it turned out to be her neighbor bringing over a watermelon. So the neighbor said he had bought a watermelon that was too big and wanted to share it. How do you think the woman felt at that moment? She said she felt an overwhelming sense of fear. What part of the watermelon is scary? The stripes? Maybe so. Why did this woman feel fear instead of gratitude? The reason is that the concept of interacting with neighbors is completely absent from the way we live today. In my opinion, the ideal home for someone living alone is a place like this. When you close your door, you should be able to fully enjoy your own perfect me time. But then, whenever you step just outside your door, there should be a we time space where you can interact with others. By the way, when do we want to be alone in our lives? When you can't stand the sight of your husband, when things get really tiresome, or when your mom's nagging just gets too loud. Am I right? At times like that, you want to have your own space. I want to live in my own house. We dream about things like that. So, once we've made up our minds and start searching diligently for a place using real estate apps, what kinds of homes do we find? Studios, officetels, dormitories, goshiwons. Most of them are small and relatively low-quality homes, right? And in fact, according to research, about 40% of all single-person households don't own their homes. They live in these kinds of places, paying monthly rent. Of course, that's because in our society today, the financial burden of owning a home alone is just too great. Did you guys see that ridiculous studio apartment that was in the news online recently? The one where the sink and the toilet are right next to each other? I don't know which genius architect designed it, but it opened up new possibilities. You can eat and study while sitting on the toilet. You don't even need to buy a chair anymore. Oh, and you can relieve yourself too. These days, living alone has become a cool and stylish image. But when I think about living alone, I still picture something kind of depressing. Even though you have to pay such expensive rent, you end up wandering around for ages because you can't find a place you really like. You keep wandering around real estate offices, and if you go for a cheaper place, you don't like it, so what happens then? You start thinking, maybe I should try to understand my mom a bit more. And you end up feeling like it might be better to just put up with the nagging and live together somehow. The reason I became interested in how to live alone in a healthy way is this. It's because I recently designed a co-living house called Mangrove for people in their 20s and 30s. The concept of a co-living house is actually quite simple. Even if your private room is small, your privacy is definitely protected. In exchange, you share facilities like the kitchen or hallways with other neighbors, but those spaces are much larger. Simply put, it's the idea of wanting to live in a spacious and luxurious home in the best part of the city, but since it's too expensive, you decide to share it with others. Recently, in cities around the world where housing prices are high, this type of living arrangement has become very popular, especially among the MZ generation in major cities. There's a spacious living room and kitchen that are always kept clean by a manager. Since they also offer community activities like yoga and meditation, you could say these homes make the most of the benefits of sharing. And now that I've introduced it like this, you might think that actually sounds pretty good. You start to feel that way, right? However, if I were to ask, would you actually give it a try? That's when you start to hesitate. You start to get worried. It makes you feel a little reluctant. Sure, having a private room is nice, but is it really okay to share the kitchen and living room? Wouldn't this end up invading the freedom and privacy I worked so hard to find? So as a designer, there were two main things I focused on here. Protecting privacy and creating brief and frequent encounters that don't feel burdensome to anyone. First, regarding privacy protection, the most important aspect of privacy, in my opinion, is this. The privacy of sound. If you've ever stayed alone in a nice hotel, especially after a long time, there's something you always end up doing. You sing in the shower. You belt out everything from the latest pop songs to IU's famous three-step high notes. The reason you can do this is because, in a hotel, you're guaranteed that your voice absolutely won't leak outside. If you tried this in a studio apartment, you'd get reported right away. By your neighbor. So, in order to live well together, the smaller the rooms are, the thicker the walls between them need to be. Interaction with neighbors was also an important point. The method I used in the design was to lower the kitchen floor by 20 centimeters. By doing this, the eye level of the person standing and cooking and the person sitting and eating becomes the same. I thought that, even if it's not burdensome, this might allow people to casually pass by and exchange a quick greeting. But honestly, there are days when you don't want to make eye contact with anyone at all. For days like that, we also designed a detour route so people can go to their rooms without being noticed by others. So, by gathering these various ideas, the building was completed. Now people in their 20s and 30s are living there. But at this point, you might be a little curious. Do people really move around as he designed? He doesn't really look like he's in his 20s or 30s. Well, it hasn't been that long since I left that age group, but still, it's true that I'm not quite one of them anymore. Anyway, I was curious about that too. So, what do you think was the way to solve this curiosity? I went and lived in that house myself to observe. I would hide in the kitchen like this. I checked to see if people made eye contact or not. Every night, I'd press my ear to the wall to see if I could hear IU songs or check what songs they were singing. What do you think would happen then? I couldn't, of course, actually do that because I'd risk being reported and arrested by the police. So the method I came up with was to call Hyunsu, a designer in his 20s from our design team. I said, Hyunsu, I'll pay your rent for a while, so could you move in and live with these people and record whether they behave according to the design ideas we came up with? Professionally, this is actually called a post-occupancy evaluation. So post-occupancy evaluation, I think it's easier to understand if you think of testing the ride quality after a release of a new car model. But unfortunately, this isn't something that commonly happens in architecture. That's because the developers who supply homes and the architects who design them aren't really interested in where you actually live. Anyway, we sent Yunsu in as a special correspondent and listened to his observations, which we just heard. Some things turned out as I expected, but to be honest, there were also some failures that need improvement. I wrote about those candidly in my book, so please check it out if you're interested. What I want to talk about today is the changes that happened to Hyunsu after living in this house. One day, while he was cooking in the kitchen, a neighbor named Dae-jun came to visit. He shared with him the recipe for a dish called lemon pasta. And then they shared the food together. Well, until then, Hyunsu had never even imagined using lemons as a main ingredient in pasta. But Dae-jun, having traveled to Italy and gained overseas experience, decided to share the new culture he had encountered with his neighbor, Hyunsu. After some time had passed, Hyunsu came to this conclusion about the changes that had happened to him. I found this story so wonderful that I'm going to read it to you just as it is. The biggest difference between life here and the life I used to live in my studio apartment is that even after just one day, the number of new events that happen in a day has increased. The density of daily life changes not so much by where you live, but by whom you live with. You know, there is a key point that I want to share with you today in this story. We've entered an era where who you live with is just as important as where you live. In a way, once we're past our 20s, we more or less graduate from learning from our parents. And from that point on, we start learning from our peers who are in similar situations to ourselves. In that case, if you live in a house like a co-living space where you're surrounded by peers, wouldn't the house become more than just a place to live? Couldn't it become a school where you learn about life? Well, of course, a place like Mangrove isn't meant to be the final destination for most of you. It's more like a stepping stone, a home you pass through at a certain stage of your life. But for people who are at an important point in life, like becoming independent in their living situation, a home like this serves as a kind of life guide. You get to meet a variety of people as neighbors, and they share their experiences with you. And that's because you help broaden each other's perspectives. Of course, YouTube lectures featuring successful people and self-help books, those things are good too. But when you learn about life through the vivid stories of your neighbors, you end up discovering the more practical know-hows. In the end, we grow through brief encounters with others. Isn't this expansion of relationships the greatest benefit you can enjoy when living alone? The three essentials for human life are clothing, food, and shelter. I believe that after clothing, food, and shelter, the next character should be Lin, meaning neighbor. Clothing, food, shelter, and neighbor. And here, neighbor doesn't refer to close and long-lasting relationships like school friends or co-workers. It's about literal neighbors who maintain a proper distance, inspire each other, and grow together. As more people live alone, the value of neighbors we can be together with will become increasingly important. I believe that after the era of living alone, the era of neighbor will come. Ultimately, the reason why living alone has become a trend now is because our society has, for so long, buried individuals and rarely given them the chance to affirm their own existence. So, our cities and homes need to undergo a major transformation to enhance the individuality, self-esteem, and personal value of each person. But we too need to change. In order to truly live alone, we must learn the skill of maintaining an appropriate distance and mingling with some moderate neighbors. And this isn't just for people in their 20s or 30s. When you need to change the direction of your life, for example, when you become independent from your parents, when you have to part ways with someone you love, or when you desperately need time alone. In other words, at those moments in life when you need a compass, this is a skill you absolutely need to know. In conclusion, the skill of living alone in a healthy way is, paradoxically, about learning how to live together with others. And at the heart of the skill of living together is learning how to connect loosely with your neighbors. As an architect, I have firmly believed that houses and cities have the power to change people. However, while working on this project, my perspective shifted a bit. In the end, it is people who change people. And a good house is one that provides the stage for the human drama created by such people. I will conclude by quoting the philosopher Emerson, whom I mentioned earlier. What decorates a house most beautifully are the friends who visit it. Thank you.